What if I told you that one of Africa's most overlooked and financially struggling nations just paid off nearly $5 billion in national debt? And did it without a single cent from the West? Sounds like a fantasy, right? But it's not. It's real. And it's Burkina Faso making history. This small, landlocked nation, often dismissed by global financial powers, has just flipped the script on the West. No IMF rescue. No World Bank loan. No foreign aid. Just grit, strategy, and belief in its own people. Burkina Faso has boldly declared, "We don't need Western lifelines to stand tall." So the big question is, why are we still clinging to the outdated belief that African countries can't survive without foreign help? For decades, the West has pushed the narrative that Africa is perpetually dependent, incapable of thriving without their handouts and conditions. But now, Burkina Faso is shattering that myth. They've just proven that self-reliance isn't just possible, it's powerful. Imagine this. A nation long labeled as one of the poorest in Africa decides to take back control of its financial future and actually pulls it off. How do they do it? Let's rewind to 2024. Dr. Apollinaire Joachim Kilem de Tamboulier, Burkina Faso's bold and unorthodox prime minister, stunned the world by announcing the full repayment of $4.79 billion in domestic debt. No begging, no strings, just strategy. It wasn't just a financial decision, it was a revolutionary act of independence. A clear message that Burkina Faso would no longer play by the rules written in Washington or Brussels. So, how did they make it work? Rather than reaching out to the usual lenders, the IMF, World Bank, or Western governments, Burkina Faso turned inward. The government issued bonds to local banks, businesses, pension funds, and individual citizens. These weren't just paper promises. They were backed by a renewed trust in the country's leadership and a surging wave of national pride. It was a high-risk move, especially in a country battling terrorism and instability. But the leadership understood something powerful. When a nation believes in itself, even adversity becomes an opportunity. The bond strategy worked, not because the money magically appeared, but because the people bought into the vision. Investors across the country placed their faith in a government that had earned their trust by demonstrating transparency, fiscal discipline, and a long-term development plan. They reinvested the raised funds into real infrastructure, roads, energy, and mining, laying down the building blocks for future economic resilience. This wasn't just about paying off old debt, it was about building a new economic reality. And perhaps most impressive of all, this was done while Burkina Faso faced some of the worst regional insecurity in the Sahel. While most nations would have crumbled under the pressure, Burkina Faso doubled down, proving that sovereignty and economic freedom go hand in hand. By leveraging its rich natural resources, particularly gold, and tapping into untapped local capital, the country showed that homegrown solutions aren't just possible. They can outperform foreign aid in both impact and dignity. Burkina Faso didn't just repay debt, they rewrote the playbook for African economic independence. Now the world is watching. If Burkina Faso can rise from the bottom and reclaim its financial destiny, what's stopping the rest of Africa? So here's the question we should all be asking. If Burkina Faso can do it, why can't others? With mining, particularly gold, forming the backbone of Burkina Faso's economy, the government strategically leveraged revenues from this sector to underpin its domestic debt. This move wasn't just financial, it was symbolic. Gold reserves acted as a form of economic insurance, giving local investors greater confidence that their funds were secure, even in a volatile region. In a world where many African nations still dance to the tune of foreign lenders, Burkina Faso chose a different rhythm: self-reliance over subservience. Under mounting external pressure to conform to Western political and fiscal conditions, Burkina Faso took a bold, almost unthinkable step for a country in its position. Rather than surrendering economic sovereignty, it doubled down on its internal resources. That gamble paid off. While the government led the charge by issuing bonds, the larger financial ecosystem in Burkina Faso stepped up. National banks, pension funds, and corporate institutions were mobilized to support the bond program. This wasn't just patriotic, it made economic sense. The bonds offered solid returns and carried the promise of national progress. In a sense, Burkina Faso transformed national debt into a shared investment in its future. The private sector became an unexpected hero in this transformation. As the government's strategy began to bear fruit and stability increased, local businesses didn't sit on the sidelines, they invested, not just in bonds, but in infrastructure and development initiatives that promised mutual benefit. This synergy between the public and private sectors created an economic momentum driven from within. Crucially, the financial market was not left static. The government and financial institutions introduced new investment vehicles, like diversified bond options, to make participation more inclusive. From major banks to small enterprises, everyone had a stake in the nation's economic recovery. As a result, liquidity flowed back into national coffers, and the debt repayment process gathered unprecedented speed. But this was about more than numbers. Paying off $4.79 billion wasn't simply a matter of balancing books. It was about transforming an economy. Burkina Faso redirected a portion of its raised funds toward large-scale infrastructure projects, especially in transport, energy, and mining, sectors essential for sustained growth. This wasn't reactionary policy. It was a deliberate long-term vision. Through these strategic investments, the country wasn't just resolving past obligations, it was engineering its economic future. It was laying the groundwork for a resilient economy, less vulnerable to external shocks, and more appealing to responsible foreign investment. Burkina Faso didn't just climb out of debt, it climbed into a new era of independence. What we're witnessing here isn't just a financial feat, it's a seismic shift in the African narrative. Burkina Faso's story is a declaration that self-sufficiency is not a myth. The country bet on its own people, its own market, and its own natural wealth, and it won. No Western bailouts, no foreign mandates, just internal unity, strategic planning, and bold leadership. This isn't only about Burkina Faso. It's a wake-up call for the entire continent. A challenge to the long-held belief that Africa must depend on others to survive. With this achievement, Burkina Faso has sent a powerful message to its neighbors and the world. Africa can chart its own course. Now, the only question that remains is, who will be next? Burkina Faso has delivered a bold message to the world. African nations possess the tools, talent, and tenacity to break free from the cycle of foreign debt. And if Burkina Faso, a country often dismissed as poor and unstable, can do it, the real question is, why haven't others followed? But here's the part that truly stuns most people. Did Burkina Faso receive any support from the West during its hour of need? Not only did they receive no help, the opposite happened. At a time when Burkina Faso was grappling with insurgencies, political instability, and deep-rooted security threats, the West, led by the European Union and other traditional powers, chose to abandon the country. Instead of offering aid, dialogue, or solidarity, they imposed sanctions and froze development assistance in response to the 2022 military coups. Rather than respond to the crisis with cooperation, Western powers opted for coercion. Their message was unmistakable. If you don't align with our political blueprint, we'll make you pay. Aid was suspended. Partnerships were severed. And the country was diplomatically and economically isolated. Sanctions weren't just about punishment. They were tactical. The intent was clear: to weaken Burkina Faso's military-led government and provoke enough internal strife to trigger return to civilian leadership aligned with Western interests. It was an attempt to force political submission by amplifying economic pressure. But what followed was not capitulation, it was defiance. Instead of crumbling, Burkina Faso did the unthinkable. It stood tall and carved its own path. President Ibrahim Traoré and his government refused to bow. They didn't plead for Western forgiveness or crawl back into dependency. They made a calculated, courageous choice to reject the script written for them. This wasn't an impulsive move, it was visionary. Burkina Faso's leadership saw through the illusion of aid that often comes tethered with control. In place of foreign financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, they chose their own people, their own economy, their own future. They placed their faith in domestic markets, local investors, and national pride. And in doing so, they sparked a quiet revolution. At a time when many African nations are told they're incapable of surviving without Western lifelines, Burkina Faso challenged the very foundation of that belief. They refused to play the role of the helpless recipient. They refused to be treated as a pawn in geopolitical games. And above all, they refused to allow the world to define their limitations. This decision to reject Western aid in favor of self-reliance marked a seismic shift, not just for Burkina Faso, but for Africa as a whole. It wasn't just a financial pivot. It was a reassertion of sovereignty, a refusal to be managed by external forces. Burkina Faso didn't just survive the storm, they redefined what it means to be independent in the 21st century. And in doing so, they sparked a critical question across the continent. If Burkina Faso can do it, who's next? Burkina Faso has decisively broken free from the traditional reliance on Western aid. No longer willing to wait for international donors to dictate its future, the country's leadership embraced a bold, homegrown strategy that, while simple, was groundbreaking. They shifted their focus to local markets, engaging businesses, banks, and individual investors to finance the country's initiatives. This was not a spontaneous decision, but a calculated one, built on the understanding that the foundation for true success lay in fostering domestic trust and confidence. The real challenge lay in convincing the people of Burkina Faso and its local investors that the nation could raise capital from within and stand on its own. This effort was all the more remarkable considering the security challenges that the country was facing at the time. The West had long assumed that in periods of instability, economies would falter and nations would crumble under pressure, expecting Burkina Faso to desperately seek external help within months. Instead, the country did the unexpected. Despite ongoing security concerns, local businesses and markets rallied behind the government's vision, demonstrating a remarkable display of national unity and resilience. Even under the weight of foreign sanctions, Burkina Faso successfully raised significant funding from local investors, effectively circumventing the usual reliance on Western creditors or foreign investors. This enabled the country to continue its development projects, pay down debt, and stabilize its economy without resorting to the typical avenues of Western financial assistance. Burkina Faso's achievement wasn't merely about surviving without external aid. It was about thriving and asserting its own economic autonomy. The West failed to recognize one crucial factor: the immense power of African self-determination. Burkina Faso's leadership demonstrated that African nations have the capability to make their own decisions, manage their resources, and stand on their own feet financially without yielding to foreign powers. This shift challenges the long-standing narrative of Africa as a continent perpetually dependent on outside help and vulnerable to external forces. Instead of viewing African nations as perpetual recipients of aid, the West should begin to recognize their capacity for self-driven growth. Burkina Faso's success proves that with visionary leadership, political will, and effective local resource mobilization, African nations can chart their own economic courses, free from the influence of foreign institutions. It serves as a powerful reminder that Africa is not a helpless continent constantly in need of external intervention. The triumph of Burkina Faso is a resounding message to the rest of the continent. You don't need to seek permission to prosper. The critical question now is, why do so many African nations continue to cling to Western aid, as if it is the only lifeline? Why do so many perpetuate a narrative of dependency, waiting for external powers to provide assistance? The uncomfortable truth is that the system of dependency benefits the West more than it benefits Africa. For years, the West has maintained a structure that allows it to extract vast wealth from Africa, while keeping African nations tethered to foreign loans and aid. The narrative of Africa as a continent in need is not a coincidence. It's a strategic design that keeps the cycle of dependence in place. For too long, Western financial institutions and governments have profited from Africa's dependence. From debt repayments to the immense profits earned by multinational corporations, the West has continued to exploit Africa's resources in various ways, both direct and indirect. However, Burkina Faso has proven that this cycle of exploitation does not have to persist. Burkina Faso's bold move has shown the world that Africa can take control of its future without leaning on foreign aid. Yet, many African nations remain tied to the notion that Western aid is their only path forward. Why does this mindset persist? The truth may be uncomfortable, but the pressing question is, will more African nations follow Burkina Faso's example and break free from the chains of foreign aid? Will they liberate themselves from the cycle of dependency and build economies that serve their people, rather than perpetuate Western interests? Burkina Faso's success is no accident. It is a strategic model for financial sovereignty. The truth is, other African nations can follow suit. Yes, it is challenging, and yes, it is risky. But Africa possesses the resources, talent, and potential to fund its own development. The key is focusing on local solutions. By nurturing domestic markets, leveraging local debt, and building investor confidence, African nations can significantly reduce their reliance on the West. However, the true challenge lies in changing the prevailing mindset. Many African nations still cling to the belief that they must depend on Western countries for survival. Burkina Faso's example shatters this misconception. Countries like Nigeria, South Africa, and others with significant economic power can, and should, break free from the cycle of foreign debt and begin to fund their own development. The question then is, why hasn't this happened yet? Why are African leaders still yielding to Western pressure and seeking financial assistance that only perpetuates a system of dependency? The solution is clear. Africa must turn inward. It must invest in its people, markets, and natural resources. It is time to stop relying on external handouts and to start building a self-sufficient future, one that prioritizes the well-being of the continent's own citizens. The real question now is, will the rest of Africa continue to adhere to the West's rules, or will it take a stand and break free from the shackles of dependency? The opportunity for change is within reach. Will Africa rise to the challenge and take decisive action to secure its own future? Let us know in the comments. Will Africa finally embrace its potential for independence? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history, culture, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Join us in this important conversation by subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just staying informed. You're becoming part of a movement dedicated to reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.